Well, hello, folks. I'm Jeffrey Darty, the Christian whistleblower, and this is Apostle Paul Antichrist, where we take a look at the indisputable historical, cultural, and biblical truth that the so-called Apostle Paul, who was called apostle only by himself and no one else, co-opted, hijacked the original message of Yeshua and turned it into a guilt and fear-based control matrix under which we still suffer today. This would be part 4, I believe, of this series. You can see it down there below, what part it really is. Go back and watch the other parts. They do build one upon the other. And I don't know how many parts there'll be, but there'll be a lot because we're going through this step by step, word by word, verse by verse in some cases, line by line in other cases. And this all started a couple of years ago with this book, Apostle Paul Antichrist. It's a book that I wrote. It's a book that was featured on Coast to Coast AM. Forward is from George Norrie. So we've had it out here a while, but I wanted to bring back an emphasis because it's been a while and there's many more people that are aware of me and my message than there were when I originally wrote the book. So we want to get as much exposure out as we possibly can. So far, we've talked about the fact that Paul, really Saul was his name, Saul in his Jewish world, Paul in his Roman world. And that's important because he was a Roman citizen. He was a Jew, and there was almost none of those people. Very, 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 very few Jews were Roman citizens. Less than 5% of the entire population of the Roman Empire were citizens, and Jewish Roman citizens was quite probably the rarest form of human that has ever walked the earth. And unbelievably, not only was Paul a Roman citizen and a Jew as well, but he had access to the most intimate parts of Judaism, having studied with Gamaliel, one of the great rabbis of all time. We also found out that Paul was related to King Herod. He was of the Herodian family tree, so he was a cousin, uncle of King Herod Antipas, who really was never had the title of king. He was tetrarch of Judea, but most people refer to him as king, even though he really never was. We also found out that Paul was friends of Nero. The two were very, very close. Whether either one of those men ever really had anything that would be considered a real friend, those two psychopaths probably were incapable of having friends. But if they did ever have a friend, they were the closest thing that the other had ever had resembling a friend. So here's Paul, knowing Nero, knowing Herod Antipas, the regent reigning, the Jewish regent reigning in Judea during the time that Yeshua was there, knowing Caiaphas, who was the high priest, Paul himself being a Pharisee. Paul was very uniquely positioned. He was really walking in three worlds: the Roman world, the Jewish religious world, and the Jewish political world. And you have to understand what happened when John the Baptist and Yeshua came on the scene. There had been 400 years of silence before those two guys showed up. And silence was a good thing unless you're a religious person. And even when you are a religious person, where it's just become professional religion, it doesn't matter to you. Silence from the heavens was a good thing unless you're a spiritual person, and there was precious few of those remaining in Jerusalem, and certainly almost none within the Jerusalem spiritual and political hierarchy, and of course Rome goes without saying. But what they had happening was two dudes, right? John the Baptist and Yeshua. And if you listen to the last broadcast on this subject, you'll see and understand how John the Baptist was really the most qualified man in all of Jerusalem to be a high priest. And that doesn't bring validity to that old religious system, but it's just saying what it is. And John the Baptist comes along And he starts preaching this doctrine of baptism for the forgiveness of sin. Now, to us, doesn't really sound like much because we've lost the perspective after 2,000 years, and because the New Testament is jumbled in its order intentionally so we wouldn't understand the perspective. You've got to realize the very center of Jewish life was the sacrificial system that took place at the temple. The only reason that Jerusalem was able to remain a nation is because of that sacrifice. Because what happened was all of the people had to come into the temple, buy an animal, pay the priest, give an offering, and that was how the money came into the temple. And of course, there were the 7 high holy days, then there were the weekly sacrifices, there were the daily sacrifices. And if you wanted your sins forgiven, that's the only way that it could be done, was going to the temple. So you can imagine the huge amount of money that was being collected. It was enough to build that temple. It was enough to staff it with priests. It was enough to fund the entire Jewish nation. Now, remember, not only did it fund the entire Jewish nation and allow the Jewish nation to be a nation, but it also allowed Caiaphas to be a high priest. It also allowed Herod, at least in his own eyes, to be a king. So from the Jewish perspective, John the Baptist was saying, hey, you don't have to do sacrifice anymore. And John the Baptist was saying you don't have to do the very thing that keeps us in business. So if you're Caiaphas, the high priest, and John has said you don't need to sacrifice anymore, that means all the priests are out of business, including the high priest. If you're the king in Jerusalem, even though he really wasn't, then you know that if your kingdom runs out of money, you're not going to be king anymore. And then if you're sitting in Rome as Nero was, and you realize that if the money dries up in Jerusalem, then you're not going to be able to get the taxes from Jerusalem anymore. So now you've got a problem at the heights of Jewish religion, at the heights of Jewish politics, and at the heights of Roman politics. You've got a problem that has to be solved. John the Baptist, and now this Yeshua guy, who many are claiming is the Messiah, who is exploding in popularity within Jerusalem beyond anything that anyone can see or has remembered in all of their memory. And here's these two guys, and they're growing legions of supporters who aren't coming to the temple anymore, aren't paying, and it's starting to trickle its way back to Rome. And, Caiaphas and Herod are saying, man, if we don't do something, they might just get rid of us. And then Rome is saying, hey, look, if we don't fix that down there, we're not going to get our money. And then here's Pontius Pilate kind of in the middle of it all. He's the one that's kind of in charge of Jerusalem, of Judea, in a real day-to-day manner. And now he's got to figure out what to do. So they had a huge problem on their hands. And then whether it was Nero, whether it was Herod, whether it was Caiaphas, or whether it was an amalgamation of all three of them, they remember this fellow Saul. Saul, friend of Nero. Saul, friend of Caiaphas. Saul, family member of Herod. Saul the Pharisee. And they said, this guy walks in all three worlds. And maybe Saul himself said, hey, look, man, I walk in all three of these worlds. I've got connections in all three of these worlds. These guys got a problem, and the guy that could solve that problem, he could be rich, famous, and powerful. I get asked quite often, what do you think motivated the motivated Saul, Paul? And I think it was money, fame, power, control. And also you have to wonder if it wasn't some possession or spiritual, whatever you want to call it, control by an entity at some point. But that's how things all settled on Paul and gave him his opportunity, because he was the most unique man within the Roman Empire and the Jewish nation and Jewish religion and Jewish politics, and he was uniquely positioned to be able to work all three ends of a particularly thorny problem. And he was given police powers. And think about what Pilate must have thought. Here's this guy given police powers in my jurisdiction to kill people, to imprison people. And Paul was set free by Rome, by Caiaphas, by Herod, and there was a hands-off policy enforced against Pilate. And the stage was set for Saul to become Paul. The stage was set for the destruction of the Yeshua movement, the elimination of Yeshua's influence, and the creation of a new religion that would usurp, ultimately, Yeshua, try to push him into memory. And if it weren't for people like me, frankly, the only one preaching this message to you in 2,000 years, they might have been successful. But I'm Jeffrey Daugherty, the Christian whistleblower. This is Apostle Paul Antichrist, how Paul hijacked and co-opted the original Yeshua message and turned it into a fear and guilt-based control matrix. And we are showing you behind the curtain, and you're seeing things you've never seen in 2,000 years, hearing things you never heard in 2,000 years, because they haven't been spoken or talked about. Give me a thumbs up in this video. It helps get our videos higher ranked. More people can see them. Like this video, subscribe to this channel. It also gets more people to view these videos, and make sure that you don't miss any of these updates. I'm doing a lot of them. I'm Jeffrey Daugherty, the Christian whistleblower. If you don't like the truth, you're not going to like me. But if you're an honest person, you do have a choice, but a choice is worthless unless you get all the information. I'm here to give you the information you need to unindoctrinate yourself.